On the morning of October 14th, 1856, the maple trees along the Shenandoah Ridge blazed like torches against a slate-colored sky. Theron Ashlock stood in the dooryard of his father's farmhouse, holding a canvas sack that contained everything his family believed he was worth. 2 shirts, a razor, a wool blanket, a tin cup, and a copy of Liebig's Chemistry in its application to agriculture that he'd bought with 3 months of fence-mending wages. His eldest brother, Horace, leaned against the porch rail with his arms crossed and a smile that wasn't kind. "You and your books," he said, drawing out the last word like it was something foul he'd stepped in. Pa left the farm to men who work the land, not men who read about it. The second brother, Raleigh, stood behind Horace like a shadow. Raleigh might have spoken up once, might have argued for a fairer share. There had been a time, years ago, when Raleigh and Theron fished together in the creek and talked about what they'd build when they were grown. But Raleigh's wife, Lucille, had settled the question weeks before the funeral. 3 brothers, 200 acres of Virginian bottomland, and Lucille had decided that 2 brothers were plenty. Their father, Josiah Ashlock, had been dead 9 days. The will, read by a lawyer named Prentice in the parlor of the house Josiah had built with his own scarred hands, left the eastern 100 acres to Horace, the western 100 to Raleigh, and to Theron, the youngest, the reader, the one who spent his evenings drawing diagrams of crop rotation by candlelight, while his brothers played cards and drank cider. Nothing. Not a single acre. Not a tool. Not even the old plow horse Nettie that Theron had nursed through colic 3 winters in a row. Horace had laughed when the lawyer finished reading. Raleigh had looked at his boots. Lucille had smiled the way a person smiles when they find money in a coat they forgot about. The lawyer, Prentice, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a conscience that occasionally troubled him, had pulled Theron aside afterward. "You could contest it," he said quietly. "Virginia law doesn't require equal division, but a court might look favorably." "No," Theron said. Not out of pride exactly, though pride was part of it. He had watched his father write that will. He had watched the old man's hand move across the paper, and he had understood, even then, that Josiah Ashlock believed learning was a kind of betrayal, that a son who read was a son who thought himself better than the dirt that fed him. There was no contesting a conviction that deep. Pa always said you had your head in the clouds. Horace continued now, pushing away from the rail. His boots scraped the boards that Theron had planed and fitted the previous summer when the old porch rotted through. "Go find your clouds, Theron. There's nothing here for you." Theron looked at the house. He looked at the fields stretching toward the river, golden brown in the autumn light, the fields he had plowed and planted and studied, learning their moods the way a doctor learns a patient's constitution. He knew which acres drained poorly in the spring. He knew where the clay ran too thick for deep roots and where the sandy loam grew the sweetest corn in the county. He had mapped the entire farm's soil composition in a leather notebook. Soil types, drainage patterns, mineral content estimated by the color and texture of what clung to his hands after rain. A notebook that Horace would probably use for kindling before the month was out. He looked at Raleigh. For a moment, just a moment, Raleigh's eyes lifted from his boots and met Theron's. Something moved in them. Guilt, maybe, or the ghost of the boy who used to sit beside his youngest brother on the creek bank and listen to him explain why the water ran clear over limestone and muddy over shale. Then Lucille touched Raleigh's arm, and whatever it was disappeared. Theron said nothing. He put the sack over his shoulder, turned west toward the mountains and walked. Words were just sounds. They couldn't hurt him unless he let them. He walked for 11 days. The Allegheny Mountains in late October were no place for a man without provisions, but Theron Ashlock was not without resources. He had grown up on the edge of these forests, and his mother, dead since he was 14, of a fever that took her in 3 days and left the household permanently diminished in ways that went beyond cooking and mending, had taught him the woods as fluently as she'd taught him his letters. She had known which roots were food and which were poison, which bark made tea and which made rope, which mushrooms could fill a belly and which could stop a heart. She had learned these things from her own mother, a woman of Scots-Irish stock who had crossed the Blue Ridge on foot in 1802 and never looked back. Theron ate pawpaws and persimmons that the frost had sweetened. He gathered black walnuts and cracked them on flat stones, picking the meats out with a thorn. He drank from limestone springs so cold they made his teeth ache and so clean they tasted of nothing but the mineral memory of ancient seas. He slept in the hollows of fallen chestnuts, their trunks wide enough to shelter a man from the wind, and twice he slept in the abandoned remains of charcoal burners' huts, their stone chimneys still standing like monuments to someone else's failed enterprise. On the third day, it rained. A cold, driving downpour that soaked through his wool blanket and turned the forest floor into a maze of rivulets. He spent that night shivering under a cedar thicket and thought about turning back. Not to the farm, that door was closed, but to some town where he could hire himself out as a laborer and stop pretending that a man with a chemistry book and no land was anything but a fool walking toward nothing. But when morning came and the mountains emerged from the mist like something the earth was remembering, he kept walking. Later in life, when people asked about those 11 days, he would say only that he had felt pulled, not by anything mystical, but by the practical sense that there was something ahead he needed to find, the same sense that made him turn a rock over in a field to see what grew beneath it. On the 6th day, he crossed into what he reckoned was Pocahontas County, in the western reaches of Virginia. The terrain grew steeper, the valleys narrower, the soil thinner. This was not farming country by any conventional measure. The ridges rose to 4,000 feet in places, their spines rocky and wind-scoured, their flanks covered in spruce and hemlock that gave way to hardwood forests. Oak, hickory, tulip poplar, and the great American chestnuts that dominated these mountains like cathedral pillars, some of them 6 feet through at the base. The people who lived here, and there were few, scratched out gardens on narrow benches of land between rock outcroppings and kept hogs that foraged in the chestnut forests for mast, growing fat on fallen nuts through the autumn. On the 8th day, he met an old man named Ezekiel Moody, sitting on a stump beside a trail, smoking a clay pipe. "Headed somewhere?" Moody asked. "West," Theron said. "That's a direction, not a destination." Moody studied him. "You got the look of a man who's been put out." Moody told him about a creek 3 miles on that followed a gorge through red sandstone, good water, some flat land on the benches, nobody claiming much of anything. And he mentioned one more thing. The hillside above that creek had a crack in it. Warmth came out. "Some folks say it's the devil's breath," Moody said. "I say it's just the earth minding its own business." On the 11th day, following the creek Moody had described, Theron found the cave. It wasn't dramatic. No yawning mouth in a cliff face, no cathedral of stalactites and subterranean rivers. It was a horizontal crack in a hillside, perhaps 4 feet tall and 8 feet wide, half hidden by a curtain of rhododendron so thick that a man could have walked within 10 feet of it and seen nothing. The creek ran 30 yards below, cutting through red sandstone that had been laid down in some unimaginable epoch when this land was the floor of a shallow sea. A stand of white oaks grew above the crack, their roots gripping the rocky slope like fingers, and the last of their leaves, burnt orange and deep russet, shivered in the October wind. Theron might have walked past it, even with Moody's directions, but he stopped because he felt it before he saw it, a warmth against his face, subtle but unmistakable, like standing near a clay oven that someone had fired hours ago. He pushed through the rhododendron and crouched at the entrance. The air coming from the crack was warm, not warm like a summer breeze or a banked fire, but warm like a root cellar in January. That steady, underground warmth that has nothing to do with the sun and everything to do with the thermal mass of the earth itself, the accumulated heat of stone that has been absorbing and releasing energy in a cycle older than anything alive on its surface. He held his hand in the gentle current of air. He estimated it at perhaps 55 degrees, though the outside temperature had dropped near freezing that morning and his fingers were numb enough that precision was difficult. His breath made clouds in the open air, but inside the crack, it didn't. He crawled inside. The crack widened after 6 feet into a chamber roughly 12 feet wide, 8 feet deep, and tall enough that he could stand if he ducked his head slightly. The floor was dry, packed earth with a scattering of sandstone fragments. The walls were damp but not dripping, a fine film of moisture that caught the meager light from the entrance and gave the stone a faint sheen, like skin after rain. And the temperature, that beautiful, constant, life-sustaining temperature, held steady throughout the chamber, a warmth that wrapped around him like a hand on his shoulder. Theron Ashlock sat on the floor of that cave and did something he had not done since his mother's funeral 12 years before. He wept. Not from sadness, though sadness was in it, threaded through like a dark vein in pale stone, but from the sudden, overwhelming recognition that the earth itself was offering him what his family had refused: shelter, a place, the raw materials of a life. He slept there that night, his wool blanket dry for the first time in 3 days, the mountain breathing its warm breath over him while the frost crept across the valley below and the stars turned in a sky he couldn't see. He spent the first week simply observing. This was Theron's way, the quality that had most infuriated his brothers. Where Horace would have immediately started hacking and building, Theron sat. He watched. He measured. He believed that understanding preceded action, that a man who built before he observed was a man who would tear down and rebuild. Using a mercury thermometer he'd traded a day's labor for at the settlement of Dunmore, 8 miles north, he took temperature readings inside the cave at dawn, noon, and dusk for 7 consecutive days. Outside, the temperatures swung from 28 degrees at night to 51 during the warmest afternoon, a range of 23 degrees. Inside, the thermometer never wavered below 54 or above 57. 3 degrees of variation against 23. He had read about this phenomenon. Liebig mentioned it, the observation that cellars at sufficient depth maintained temperatures close to the annual mean. A pamphlet on French agriculture described the caves of the Loire Valley, where wine had been stored for centuries in conditions that rarely varied. The principle was simple. The earth, at depth, acts as a thermal buffer, maintaining a temperature that approximates the region's annual average. In this part of the Alleghenies, that meant the mid-50s Fahrenheit. Not warm enough to sit comfortably, but warm enough to keep a man alive through winter. And critically, warm enough to keep food from freezing, and cool enough to keep it from spoiling. He began to think about root cellars, not the shallow, dirt-floored rooms that every farm wife in Virginia used for winter storage. Too cold in January, too warm in July, always at the mercy of seepage and vermin. What Theron envisioned was fundamentally different, a series of rooms carved into living rock, ventilated by the mountain's own breath, humidified by its moisture, stabilized by the sheer mass of stone on every side. He spent the rest of October thinking, and in November he began to build. He started with the white oaks. Felling timber alone, with a single axe, is work that tests a man in ways beyond strength. Strength matters. The first blow and the 100th must be struck with equal precision. But what matters more is patience. Theron selected trees carefully, choosing straight-grained specimens between 10 and 14 inches in diameter, large enough to hew into beams, but small enough for one man to handle. He felled them one at a time and dragged them to the cave entrance using a rope and lever system rigged from the living trees, using the slope of the hillside to do the work that a horse would have done on flat ground. His only tools were the axe, a crosscut saw he purchased in Dunmore on credit from Potts, and a hand auger he fashioned from a broken wagon spoke and a piece of hardened steel. The work was brutal. His hands cracked and bled. His shoulders ached in ways that made sleep difficult and waking worse. But the cave kept him alive. Each night, he crawled back into that 55-degree chamber, wrapped himself in his wool blanket on a bed of dried leaves he'd gathered and piled 6 inches deep, and slept more soundly than he ever had in his father's house. The mountain breathed its warm breath over him while the frost crept across the valley below. And in the mornings, when he emerged into air that hurt his lungs, the cave at his back felt less like a hole in a hillside and more like a hand held out in welcome. By early December, he had framed a timber entrance to the cave that sealed properly against wind and animals, while still allowing the natural ventilation he had observed, a gentle circulation of air from deep within the hillside that prevented the stagnation and mold that plagued conventional root cellars. He understood intuitively what engineers would later call the chimney effect or stack ventilation. The cave, he had discovered during his week of observation, had 2 openings: the main entrance where he'd crawled in, and a smaller fissure, barely the width of a man's fist, higher on the slope, roughly 40 feet above and 60 feet to the northeast. Warm air, being lighter than cold air, rose naturally through the hillside and exited through the upper fissure, creating a partial vacuum at the lower entrance that drew fresh air inward. The result was a constant, gentle breeze that moved through the cave at roughly the speed of a slow walk, enough to prevent stagnation and regulate humidity, but not enough to create drafts that would dry out stored goods. Theron sealed the main entrance with his timber frame and fitted it with a door he built from oak planks. But he left gaps at the top and bottom, adjustable gaps, controlled by sliding panels he could open or close, that allowed him to regulate the airflow. He widened the upper fissure slightly, enough to improve the draw without compromising the hillside's structural integrity, and fitted it with a wooden cap that could be opened or closed depending on conditions. In winter, he kept the upper fissure partially closed to retain warmth. In summer, he opened it fully to maximize the draw of cool underground air through the chambers. Then he began to dig. Working inward and downward from the original chamber, using a pickaxe and a flat-bladed shovel, Theron expanded the cave over the course of that first winter. The sandstone was layered, hard reddish strata alternating with softer gray shale that could be worked with hand tools if you had the patience to follow its grain rather than fight it. The hard layers became his ceilings. The soft layers became his floors and walls, carved back in smooth arcs that distributed weight naturally and prevented the collapse that would have threatened a square-cornered room. He learned the rock the way he had learned the soil on his father's farm, by touching it, smelling it, listening to it. Different strata rang differently when struck with a pick. A hollow sound meant loose stone or a void behind the wall. He learned to shore these spots with oak before advancing. A dull thud meant solid, reliable sandstone that would hold its shape for a century. A sharp metallic ring meant a layer of ironstone, beautiful but nearly impossible to work, and he learned to route around it, letting the iron-rich bands become natural shelves and ledges in his walls. He carved drainage channels in the floor, angled at a slight grade, no more than a 1/4 inch per foot, just enough to encourage flow without creating slippery surfaces that directed any seepage toward the cave entrance and out to the creek below. He carved shelves directly into the softer stone of the walls, angling them slightly backward so that anything placed on them would lean against the wall rather than slide forward, and spacing them 18 inches apart vertically. Enough room for a crock of sauerkraut or a row of potatoes laid end to end. By the end of January 1857, working 6 to 8 hours a day in the cave, the rest of his daylight spent hunting, gathering wood, and performing the 100 small tasks that survival demanded, he had expanded the original chamber by half and begun a second chamber beyond it, connected by a passage 3 feet wide and 5 feet tall. The second chamber was cooler by 2 degrees, further from the entrance, deeper into the hillside, more insulated by the mass of stone above and around it. By March, the cave had grown from a single chamber into 3 connected rooms, totaling roughly 400 square feet. The innermost room, Room 3, as he labeled it in the margins of Liebig's book, maintained the most stable temperature, a steady 55 degrees, regardless of whether it was 15 degrees outside or 50. The middle room fluctuated between 50 and 60 degrees, a range he would later learn to narrow by adjusting the passage widths between chambers. The outermost room, behind the timber door, served as a transitional space that buffered the interior against sudden temperature changes, the way a mudroom buffers a farmhouse against winter air. Theron had built, without knowing the formal term for it, a thermal gradient storage system. Each room offered slightly different conditions, different temperatures, different humidity levels, different airflow patterns, suited to different types of food preservation. It was not an accident. It was observation translated into architecture, and it was the first sign that Theron Ashlock's mind worked in a way that his family had never understood and his community had not yet learned to value. The people of Dunmore thought he was mad. This was not unusual or particularly cruel. Small mountain communities in the 1850s had limited tolerance for eccentricity, and a man living alone in a cave, covered in rock dust, talking about temperatures and air circulation and thermal mass to anyone who would listen, and most would not, was eccentric by any measure. They called him the mole behind his back and sometimes to his face. Children dared each other to creep up to the cave entrance and peek inside. The shopkeeper, Potts, extended credit with the wary expression of a man who suspects he is funding a lunatic but cannot quite bring himself to refuse, because the lunatic always pays eventually and buys interesting things: thermometers, iron brackets, lamp oil, and seeds. The women of Dunmore pitied him, which was worse than mockery. They left food on his path sometimes, a jar of preserves, a loaf of corn pone wrapped in cloth, the way you leave food for a stray dog that you don't want to encourage, but can't bear to let starve. Theron ate what they left and was grateful, and if he noticed the pity, he gave no sign. But Theron was not merely digging a hole in a mountain. He was conducting an experiment. And experiments, by their nature, require the one thing that mockery is designed to destroy: the willingness to look foolish in pursuit of an answer. That first spring, he planted a quarter-acre garden on the bench of land above the cave. The soil was thin, 6 to 10 inches of topsoil over fractured sandstone, but surprisingly fertile. Centuries of leaf fall from the oak and chestnut forest had built up a rich layer of humus, dark and crumbly, and smelling of the particular sweetness that only well-aged organic matter produces. Beneath the humus, the fractured sandstone provided excellent drainage, preventing the waterlogging that killed root crops in the heavy clay soils of the lowlands. Theron composted aggressively, hauling manure from Potts's stable in a canvas sack in exchange for a day's labor each month, supplementing it with leaf mold, wood ash from his fire, and the cleaned entrails of the deer and rabbits he hunted. He built 3 compost piles in a rotation, one building, one cooking, one ready to use, and turned them weekly with a fork he made from a hickory sapling, 4 tines fire-hardened and bound with rawhide. He planted potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, cabbages, and onions, the staples of mountain subsistence. But he also planted varieties his neighbors would have considered foolish for the altitude: winter squash, dried beans of 3 varieties, and a strain of late-season apple he grafted onto wild rootstock found in a nearby hollow. The wild trees were scrubby and barely edible, but their roots were magnificently adapted to the thin, rocky soil, and Theron reasoned that a cultivated variety grafted onto that rootstock might combine the best of both worlds. The grafts took, 4 of 7 survived, and though he would not taste their fruit for 3 years, the apples would become one of the best storing varieties in his cave. He harvested through the fall of 1857, working from dawn until the light failed, pulling potatoes from the earth and brushing them clean, cutting cabbages at the base and stripping their outer leaves, digging carrots and beets and laying them in rows to dry briefly in the autumn sun before carrying them underground. He stored everything in the cave. The results exceeded his most careful hopes. Potatoes placed on the stone shelves in room 3 in October were still firm and unsprouted in February. Carrots buried in boxes of damp creek sand maintained their crispness for 4 months. Cabbages hung upside down from ceiling beams lasted into March, drawing moisture from the humid air. Turnips and beets held nearly as well. The onions he stored in room 1, where lower humidity and better airflow suited them. They dried to a papery crispness and held for months. The steady temperature was only part of the explanation. The cave's natural humidity, near 90% in the innermost chamber, prevented the shriveling that ruined surface-stored vegetables, and the constant air circulation prevented the mold that turned ordinary root cellars into reeking caverns of decay by late winter. Theron kept meticulous records. He weighed his produce going in and weighed it coming out. He tracked losses by variety, by storage method, by chamber location, by week. He noted which shelves lost less than others. Lower shelves, where humidity collected, were better for root vegetables. Higher shelves, where air moved more freely, were better for cabbages and squash. He filled 3 notebooks that first year alone, purchasing them from Potts with labor credits, and the data they contained, raw, unprocessed, gathered by a single man with a scale, a thermometer, and an obsessive commitment to accuracy, represented what may have been the most detailed empirical study of underground food storage conducted in America up to that time. His losses, calculated at the end of the first full storage season, were under 8%. The regional average for farmers using conventional root cellars, above-ground storage, or simple burial was between 25 and 40%. In the spring of 1858, a man named Dr. Amos Whitfield rode through Dunmore on his way to a mineral survey in the Greenbrier Valley. Whitfield was a geologist attached to the Virginia State Survey, a lean, restless man of about 45 with wire spectacles, a sunburned nose, and the kind of appetite for curiosity that makes a man ride 3 extra miles to see something interesting. He stopped at Potts's store for supplies, coffee, hardtack, lamp oil, and heard the locals laughing about the mole. "He lives in a cave," Potts said, chuckling as he weighed coffee beans. "Keeps vegetables in there like a squirrel keeps nuts. Thinks he's discovered something." "What kind of vegetables?" Whitfield asked. "Potatoes mostly, carrots. He had turnips come out of that hill in March looking like they'd been pulled yesterday. I'll grant him that." Potts shrugged. "But the man's half wild. Talks to himself, writes in books. I've seen him measure the air with a thermometer like it's something a person does." Whitfield, unlike Potts, was professionally inclined to take measurements seriously. He rode out to Theron's hillside that afternoon, following a track that was barely a track, more like a suggestion made by footprints and broken branches. What he found silenced him for a long moment. Theron had expanded the cave to over 600 square feet. The entrance was neatly framed in white oak with a proper door hung on hand-forged hinges. The interior walls had been smoothed with a precision that Whitfield recognized as more than instinct. The shelving system was elegant, angled to allow air circulation behind stored goods, spaced to prevent ethylene buildup from ripening fruit, each shelf cut with a shallow groove along its back edge that served as an air channel. "You understand," Whitfield said slowly, examining the temperature readings Theron had chalked on a flat section of wall, a makeshift chart showing daily readings for 15 months. "That what you've built here is essentially a temperature-regulated storehouse using geothermal principles?" Theron nodded. He was covered in rock dust, as usual, and his hair had grown long enough to tie back with a leather thong. He looked less like a farmer and more like a medieval quarryman. "The earth holds its heat steady," he said. "I just gave it rooms." Whitfield stayed 3 days. He measured everything, temperatures, humidity, using a wet and dry bulb method that Theron had not known, airflow velocity, using smoke from a tallow candle, wall thickness, passage dimensions. He drew diagrams. He asked questions. He was particularly fascinated by the ventilation system, the way Theron had widened the natural upper fissure slightly and fitted it with a wooden damper that could be adjusted to control airflow by degrees. In summer, opening the damper fully drew cool cave air through the chambers, creating a natural cooling effect that kept the interior below 60 degrees, even when the outside temperature climbed into the 80s. In winter, partially closing, it retained the Earth's warmth while still preventing the stagnation that bred mold and off flavors in stored food. "This is publishable work," Whitfield told Theron on the 3rd evening, sitting on a log outside the cave entrance while the sun dropped behind the western ridge and the first stars appeared in a sky so clear it looked polished. "You should write it up for the agricultural journals. The Southern Planter would print it tomorrow." Theron shook his head. "I'd rather grow food." Whitfield did write about it, though, a brief mention in his geological survey report, noting an ingenious application of geothermal principles to food preservation in Pocahontas County, and a longer letter to the editor of the Southern Planter magazine, describing in detail the construction and performance of what he called Mr. Ashlock's Hillside Storehouse, a root cellar that preserved vegetables with losses under 8%. a figure that would have astonished any farmer in the state, and that, when the letter was published that June, did exactly that. The letter brought visitors. Not many at first. A handful of farmers from neighboring counties who rode half a day or more to see what the fuss was about, arriving with the skeptical expressions of men who've been told a fish story and expect to see a minnow. Most arrived skeptical and left quiet, turning the implications over in their minds as they rode home through the mountains. A few came back with questions. One, a taciturn man named Jessup from Greenbrier County, came back 3 times and eventually dug his own hillside cellar using a modified version of Theron's design. It didn't work as well. Jessup's hillside faced north, which altered the ventilation dynamics. But it worked well enough to cut his winter storage losses by half, and he told his neighbors, who told theirs. Among the visitors, in September of 1858, was a young woman named Clara Dietrich. Clara was the daughter of a German immigrant family who had settled in the Greenbrier Valley in 1848. Her father, Heinrich, was a cabinet maker from the Black Forest region of Baden, with precise hands and English so imprecise that his daughter had served as his translator since she was 8. Her mother, Margaret, had died of cholera during the Atlantic crossing, buried at sea. Clara, then 6, had watched the shroud slide over the rail and into the gray Atlantic and decided, with a child's terrible clarity, that she would never let the world take something from her without understanding why. She was 24 now, small and dark-haired and direct. She ran her father's household, kept his books, and read everything she could borrow, buy, or trade for. She had read Whitfield's letter in the Southern Planter and decided to see the cave for herself. Theron was underground when she arrived, widening a shelf in room 2. He emerged covered in sandstone dust, blinking in the September sunlight, to find a woman in a dark blue dress standing beside his garden, examining his bean trellises with an expression of frank, professional appraisal. "Your pole beans are too close together," she said, by way of introduction. "They'll shade each other out by midsummer. You want 8 inches between plants, not 6. Theron looked at the beans. She was right. He had known she was right before she said it, had noticed the shading problem in July, and resolved to adjust the spacing next season. But he had not expected to hear his own observation spoken aloud by a stranger in a blue dress, who was examining his garden with the eye of someone who understood gardens. "I'm Clara Dietrich," she said. "I read about your cave in the Southern Planter. I want to see it." He showed her. She ducked through the entrance without hesitation. Most visitors paused at the threshold, reluctant to enter the darkness, and stood in room 1 with her hands clasped behind her back, looking at the shelves, the ceiling, the drainage channels in the floor, the way the lantern light played on the curved stone walls. She asked better questions than Whitfield had, not geological questions, but practical ones. Questions about humidity control, about which varieties stored best on which shelves, about whether he had tried layering sand and straw in alternating beds for carrot storage, about whether he had considered lactofermentation in the stable temperatures. That last question stopped him. "Fermentation?" he said. Clara's eyes were brown and very steady. "You're thinking about this as storage," she said, "keeping things as they are, but the conditions in here, the temperature, the humidity, the airflow, they're ideal for controlled fermentation. Sauerkraut, pickled beets, fermented beans. My family has been fermenting food for generations. In Bavaria, the farmhouses had cool cellars where crocks of sauerkraut lasted years. Your cave is better than any cellar I've ever seen or read about." She paused. "You should think about it not just as preservation," she said, "but as transformation. It was the most anyone had ever understood about his work in a single conversation. Theron stood in the cave he had carved with his own hands and felt something shift, not in the stone, but in himself. Clara returned twice more that autumn, each time bringing something. The first time, she brought a crock of her father's sauerkraut, dense, tangy, golden, fermented to a complexity of flavor that Theron had never tasted in the watery, half-sour versions he'd eaten as a child, and a book on German cold storage techniques that she had translated into English herself, writing the translation in the margins of the original in a hand so small and precise it looked like typesetting. The second time, she brought a packet of seeds for a winter-hardy cabbage variety her family had brought from Bavaria. A dense, dark green cultivar with leaves so thick they felt almost waxy, and a jar of pickled beets that turned the bread Theron ate with them a vivid, impossible crimson. On her third visit, she brought her father. Heinrich Dietrich was a small, muscular man with gray-streaked hair and hands that were, despite their roughness, as articulate as a surgeon's. He examined the timber framing of the cave entrance with a cabinet-maker's eye, running his fingers along the joints, testing the fit of mortise against tenon, pressing his thumb into the grain to gauge the wood's seasoning, and pronounced it good work, but the joints could be tighter. He said this in German. Clara translated. Theron understood the verdict before the translation finished because Heinrich's expression, a mixture of respect and professional dissatisfaction, was the same in any language. Heinrich returned the following week with his tools, a chest of chisels, planes, augers, and saws that represented 30 years of a craftsman's accumulation, and spent 3 days rebuilding the entrance frame with mortise and tenon joinery so precise that Theron could not fit a knife blade into the seams. The wood was white oak, seasoned 2 years in Heinrich's workshop, and the joints were secured not with nails, but with wooden pegs driven into offset holes that pulled the joints tight as they were hammered home, a technique called draw boring that Heinrich had learned from his own father in the Black Forest. When he finished, the entrance looked less like a mine shaft and more like the doorway of a house. Heinrich stood back, examined his work, nodded once, and said something in German that Clara translated as, "Now it will last." It did. That frame, repaired but not replaced, still stands. Theron asked Clara to marry him on the 1st day of December, 1858, standing at the entrance to the cave while the first snow of winter settled on the oaks above them, and the mountain breathed its warm air against their backs. He had no ring. He had no money, no land deed, no fine clothes, nothing that the world considered necessary for a proposal of marriage. He had a cave, a garden, 3 notebooks of data, and the conviction, quiet, unshakable, burning like the coal bed of a well-banked fire, that he could build a life worth sharing. Clara said yes without hesitation. They married on Christmas Day in the Lutheran church in Dunmore, with Heinrich and Garfield Potts as witnesses. The minister, a young man who had arrived in the county only that fall, mispronounced Theron's name twice during the ceremony, and Potts, who had once laughed about the mole, gave them a set of iron cookware as a wedding gift and forgave the remainder of Theron's credit account, which was either generosity or an investment in a customer who was clearly not going anywhere. The years between 1859 and 1862 were years of building. Theron and Clara expanded the cave system to over 1,200 square feet, adding a 4th chamber that Clara designed specifically for fermentation. This room was different from the others, cooler by 2 degrees, its ventilation partially restricted to maintain slightly higher humidity, its walls lined with shelves built by Heinrich specifically to hold the heavy stone crocks that fermentation required. Each crock sat in a niche carved into the wall, surrounded by stone on 3 sides. the thermal mass of the mountain holding the fermentation temperature steady within a range of 2 degrees, conditions that modern food scientists would later identify as nearly ideal for lactofermentation. They built a proper cabin above the cave entrance, a single-room structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney and a plank floor, using it for living quarters, while the cave below served as storehouse, workshop, and root cellar. Heinrich helped with the construction, riding out from Greenbrier Valley every few weeks with a tool or a technique or a piece of advice that saved Theron days of trial and error. The cabin was simple but well made, tight-jointed, weather-sealed, oriented with its single window facing south to catch the winter sun, and its back wall sheltered by the hillside from the northwest wind. Clara's instinct about fermentation proved correct in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. Sauerkraut made with her Bavarian cabbage and fermented in the cave's 4th chamber developed a depth of flavor that ordinary sauerkraut could not match. At 53 degrees, the lactofermentation proceeded slowly, far more slowly than in the 70-degree kitchens where most farm wives made their kraut. Slow fermentation meant more complete conversion of sugars, more complex acid profiles, and none of the sharp tang that fast-fermented kraut carried. Pickled beans, fermented beets, and vinegar-preserved vegetables all benefited similarly. By 1860, they were producing more preserved food than they could eat. Clara began selling at the Dunmore market, crocks of sauerkraut, jars of pickled beets, barrels of stored potatoes and apples. The quality was conspicuously superior to anything else available. Potatoes that other farmers sold soft and sprouting in February, Theron and Clara offered firm and sound in April. People noticed. They began to speak of Theron Ashlock differently, not yet with respect exactly, but with the uneasy acknowledgement that a man who can do something you cannot is not entirely a fool. Then the war came. The Civil War reached Pocahontas County not as battles. No major engagements were fought in those remote mountains, though skirmishes flickered through the hollows like brush fires, but as scarcity. Men left for the armies, both Union and Confederate. The county was divided in its loyalties as much of Western Virginia was, and the ones who remained faced requisition parties from both sides who took livestock, grain, salt, and anything else they could carry. The harvests of 1862 and 1863 were poor, diminished by the absence of labor and the disruption of the supply lines that had brought seed, tools, and salt from the lowland cities. Theron was not called to serve. At 34, he was within the age range for conscription, but he had no legal residence, no property deed, and no connection to any militia or civic role. He existed in the eyes of the government somewhere between citizen and phantom. Neither army came to recruit him, and neither army's foragers found his hillside, which was far enough from any road that a man had to want to reach it. The winter of 1863 to 64 was the hungry one. By January, families in the hollows and valleys around Dunmore were running short. Root cellars that had been adequate in good years were empty 2 months early. The salt pork was gone. The cornmeal was running low. The sugar, which came from lowland mills and had not arrived since the previous spring, was a memory. Children cried at night with the dull, persistent ache of insufficient food. Not starvation, not yet, but the slow erosion of strength that comes from eating less than the body requires, day after day, until the deficit accumulates into weakness and sickness and the kind of fear that settles into a household like cold air and doesn't leave. Theron and Clara had 1,200 square feet of cave packed to its stone ceilings. They had planned for this, not specifically for war. Theron had no gift for predicting the behavior of governments or armies, but for the certainty, which any farmer who has lived through enough seasons understands in his bones, that bad years come. Theron had expanded his garden every year, terracing additional benches into the hillside above the cave, composting relentlessly, rotating crops with a discipline that his neighbors found excessive and slightly obsessive until they found it prescient. Clara had fermented and preserved with the same disciplined foresight. Always more than they needed. Always another crock, another barrel, another shelf filled against the possibility of the year when the garden failed, or the frost came early, or the world, for whatever reason, stopped providing. They had 3 years of surplus underground. They began distributing food in February of 1864. It was not charity in any way that made people uncomfortable. They simply let it be known, through Potts's store, that anyone who needed food could come to the cave and receive it. They asked nothing in return. They made no speeches. They kept no ledger of debts. Over the course of that winter and the following spring, by Clara's careful count, they fed 214 people. Whole families walked miles through snow to fill sacks with potatoes and turnips and jars of sauerkraut. An elderly widow named Agnes Parsons, too frail to make the walk, received a weekly delivery that Theron made on foot, regardless of the weather. He never missed a delivery. A family named Kessler, husband, wife, 4 children, arrived in March, half-starved, having walked 2 days from a hollow where the war had taken everything. Clara fed them for 2 weeks. Theron gave them seed potatoes and helped them find land to plant. The Kesslers never left. Their descendants live in Pocahontas County still. No one called Theron the Mole anymore. News of Horace and Raleigh reached Theron in fragments over the years, carried by travelers and the occasional letter that found its way across the mountains through the informal postal network of peddlers, ministers, and men who simply liked to walk. Horace had gambled on tobacco, planting the eastern 100 acres in a single cash crop that fetched high prices in 1858 and lower prices every year thereafter as the soil thinned and the market shifted. Tobacco is a hungry crop. It devours soil nutrients the way fire devours timber, leaving ash behind. And Horace, who had never paid attention to Theron's diagrams of crop rotation and nutrient cycling, made no effort to replenish what the tobacco took. By 1862, the land was visibly depleted, the yields declining, the plants sickly. By 1865, with the war's end and the collapse of the southern tobacco economy, Horace was ruined. He sold the land to a northern speculator for 12 cents on the dollar and moved to Richmond, where he worked as a day laborer until typhoid took him in 1871. He was 49. Raleigh fared somewhat better, or at least longer. He kept the Western 100 in mixed farming, corn, wheat, a few cattle, but Lucille's appetites outpaced the land's capacity. She wanted a larger house, so they borrowed. She wanted a carriage, so they borrowed again. She wanted the respectability that money provides, and Raleigh, who had never been able to refuse her anything, mortgaged the land to give it to her. The debt accumulated. The interest compounded. Thomas died in 1878, still on the land, but owing more than it was worth. Lucille sold it within the month and moved to her sister's house in Baltimore. No record tells what became of her after that. Theron learned of these events without satisfaction. He had never wished his brothers ill. He had not walked west in anger, or with the dream of someday returning to show them what he'd built. He had simply walked away and built something, and the building had been enough. The building had always been enough. After the war, Theron's reputation grew in the way that reputations grow in mountain communities, slowly, through demonstrated results rather than proclamation. the way a tree grows, invisibly on any given day, unmistakably over years. Farmers from increasingly distant counties came to see the cave. Some came once and went home to dig their own, with varying degrees of success. The ones who listened carefully and chose their hillsides well did best. The ones who dug straight back into any convenient slope without studying the ventilation or the water table learned expensive lessons in flooding and collapse. Others came repeatedly, studying Theron's methods the way apprentices study a master, asking questions that grew more sophisticated with each visit as their own experience caught up with their curiosity. In 1867, Theron began teaching formally, not in a schoolhouse, but on his own hillside, leading small groups through the chambers and explaining the principles he had spent a decade refining. He was not a natural speaker. His voice was quiet, his sentences short, but he had the teacher's essential gift, the ability to make the invisible visible. "Feel the air," he would say, standing in the passage between rooms. "Feel it move. Where is it coming from? Where is it going? Why?" And the farmers, who knew wind and weather the way they knew their own hands, understood. Clara bore 4 children between 1860 and 1869, 2 sons, Joseph and Samuel, and 2 daughters, Anna and Margaret. They grew up in the cabin above the cave, playing in the chambers their father had carved from stone, learning to read the thermometer before they could read a printed page. Joseph, the eldest, was quiet and watchful like his father, with a particular gift for fermentation that delighted Clara. By the age of 12, he was managing the sauerkraut crocks with a precision that would have done credit to a Bavarian brewmaster. Samuel, the second son, was restless and bright-eyed and hungry for the world beyond the mountains. He asked questions not to understand the cave, but to understand everything else, and Theron recognized in him the same quality that had driven his own curiosity, turned outward instead of inward. Anna, the elder daughter, inherited Clara's practicality and Heinrich's precision with tools. She could joint a board at 14 with a steadiness that made grown men careful about their own work. Margaret, the youngest, had Theron's quiet way of watching, his habit of sitting still and letting the world reveal itself. Heinrich Dietrich lived with them until his death in 1872, building furniture in a workshop he'd set up in the outermost cave chamber, where the constant temperature and humidity kept his wood stable. No warping, no cracking, no seasonal movement of the kind that plagued woodworkers in ordinary shops. His last piece, a cradle for Margaret's future children, carved from a single piece of cherry with dovetails so fine they were almost invisible, sat in the cave for 20 years before it was needed, and the wood never moved. Not a crack, not a warp, not a split. The cave held it as steadily as it held everything else. By the 1880s, Theron's cave system had grown to over 2,000 square feet, containing 7 distinct chambers, each calibrated for a different purpose: long-term root storage, general vegetable storage, deep preservation, fermentation, cheese aging, a practice Clara had learned from a Swiss family named Geyer, who settled nearby in 1870. Apple and fruit storage with ventilation adjusted to carry away ethylene gas, and a small library where the constant temperature and humidity protected Theron's growing collection of agricultural texts and notebooks from the damp and insects that destroyed paper in ordinary mountain cabins. The techniques they had developed were being adopted across the region. Farmers in West Virginia were building what they called ashlock cellars, carved into hillsides rather than dug beneath barns, oriented for natural ventilation, and fitted with adjustable damper systems. Not all of them worked. Some hillsides lacked the right geology, some builders cut corners, but the successful ones transformed the food security of their communities, extending storage seasons by months and cutting losses to levels their grandparents would not have believed. In 1884, a professor named Harlan Coe from the new West Virginia University in Morgantown visited the cave and spent a week taking measurements with instruments more precise than anything Theron had ever owned. Coe was a young man, earnest and academic, and he approached the cave with the careful reverence of a scholar who recognizes that he is standing in the presence of empirical knowledge that his institution has not yet caught up with. He confirmed what Theron had observed for nearly 3 decades. The innermost chamber maintained a temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with less than 2 degrees of annual variation, and a relative humidity between 88 and 92%. These conditions, Coe noted in his subsequent paper for the West Virginia Agricultural Experiment Station, were remarkably close to the optimal ranges that European agricultural scientists had only recently established through controlled laboratory experiments. Theron, then 56 years old, his hair gone white and his beard full, his hands scarred and thickened by 3 decades of work, but still steady, showed the professor his notebooks, 28 volumes of daily temperature readings, humidity observations, crop storage records, fermentation notes, and the careful drawings of cave cross-sections and ventilation diagrams that mapped the evolution of the system year by year. Coe stared at them for a long time. "Mr. Ashlock," he said at last, "you have assembled by yourself one of the most complete empirical records of underground food storage in this country, perhaps on this continent." "Wasn't by myself," Theron said. "Clara did half." "More than half," Clara corrected from across the room, where she was labeling a row of jars with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. Coe smiled. "I stand corrected. Mr. and Mrs. Ashlock, your work is extraordinary. May I have permission to reference your data in my paper?" "You can reference anything you like," Theron said. "Knowledge isn't worth much if you lock it in a cave." He paused, then added with the faintest trace of a smile, "Though it does keep well in one." Theron Ashlock died on March 7th, 1891, at the age of 63. He died in the cabin above the cave, in the bed that Heinrich Dietrich had built from cherry wood 30 years before, its joints still tight, its surface worn smooth by decades of use. Clara sat beside him, her hand on his. Joseph stood at the foot of the bed. Samuel had come home from Colorado, where he had gone to work in the mining industry, applying the underground principles he had learned from his father in a context his father could not have imagined. Anna stood by the window, her arms crossed, her jaw set in the way it set when she was trying not to cry. Margaret, the youngest, sat in the corner with her infant daughter in her arms, the first grandchild, born 3 weeks before Theron fell ill, sleeping in the cherry cradle that Heinrich had carved 20 years ago, and the cave had preserved without a mark, without a warp, without a single flaw. It was the end of winter. Outside the window, the last of the snow was melting from the south-facing slope, and the first hepatica were blooming in the leaf litter beneath the oaks, small, pale purple flowers that pushed through dead leaves with a persistence that seemed almost willful. Inside the cave below, the temperature held at 55 degrees, as it always had, as it always would. Theron had been ill for 2 weeks. His lungs, weakened by decades of breathing rock dust, the one price the mountain had exacted for its gifts, had finally given out. He did not complain. He lay in bed and looked at the ceiling Heinrich had built, and listened to the wind in the oaks, and when his family gathered near, spoke to them quietly. To Joseph, who would take over the stewardship of the cave, "The mountain will tell you what it needs if you listen. Don't assume you know. Measure, record, pay attention to what changes and what doesn't." To Samuel, "You went far. That's good. But remember what you learned here. The principles don't change just because the rock does. To Anna, you build well. Build things that last. Your grandfather knew that. The world doesn't need more things. It needs better ones. To Margaret, holding her sleeping daughter, teach her to look. That's the start of everything. And then, to Clara, he said something that she never repeated to anyone, but that, by the look on her face when people asked about it in later years, must have been sufficient. His last words, spoken to the room at large as the afternoon light turned golden and the hepatica bloomed on the hill outside, were simple. "There's always more to find," he said. "Keep looking." He closed his eyes. The mountain breathed. Clara Ashlock lived until 1904. She maintained the cave and the gardens with the help of Joseph and Anna, who built their own homes on adjacent parcels. She continued to sell sauerkraut and preserved vegetables at the Dunmore market until she was 70, and the quality never declined. She added 2 more notebooks to the collection, bringing the total to 36 volumes that documented 46 years of underground food storage and fermentation, a record that, when it was eventually cataloged by a West Virginia University archivist in 1952, was described as without parallel in the amateur agricultural literature of the 19th century. Joseph expanded the cave system one final time in 1895, adding an 8th chamber that he dedicated to seed storage, an idea his father had discussed in his final years, but never completed. Seeds stored in the cave's stable environment maintained viability for years longer than conventionally stored seeds, a fact that Joseph proved through careful germination trials and that his meticulous records he had inherited his parents' devotion to data. Later confirmed. Some of the seed varieties Joseph preserved in the cave during the 1890s were still viable when tested in the 1920s, having been maintained at conditions that modern seed banks would spend millions of dollars to replicate. Samuel made his fortune in Colorado and returned to Pocahontas County in 1910, building a large house on the ridge above the cave. He never lived in the cave himself, but he funded the construction of a stone wall around the entrance that protected it from erosion, and he paid for the printing of a pamphlet written by Anna that described the cave's construction and principles in plain language accessible to any farmer. The pamphlet was distributed free throughout the state and was reprinted 3 times. Margaret's daughter, Theron's first grandchild, the infant who had slept in the cherry cradle on the day of his death, grew up to study botany at what was then called the West Virginia Colored Institute, and later became West Virginia State University. She wrote her senior thesis on underground food preservation techniques in Appalachian communities, drawing on her grandfather's notebooks and her grandmother's records. It was the first academic paper to use the Ashlock data, and it would not be the last. The Ashlock Cave still exists. It sits on a wooded hillside in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, accessible by a dirt road that branches off a state highway 6 miles south of what is now the town of Durban. The cabin is gone, replaced in the 1930s by a modest frame house that Joseph's grandson built. But the cave entrance, with Heinrich Dietrich's mortise and tenon framing still intact beneath layers of protective repair, the original oak darkened to the color of old iron but sound as the day it was set, opens into the same chambers that Theron carved by hand beginning in the winter of 1856. The temperature inside, measured by digital instruments installed by a West Virginia University research team in 2003, holds at 54.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity averages 90%. The ventilation system, its wooden dampers replaced twice, but its principle unchanged, still draws air through the hillside in a slow, steady breath. Descendants of the Ashlock family still use the cave for storage. They keep potatoes and apples and jars of sauerkraut on the same stone shelves that Theron carved with a pickaxe, and a vision of what the mountain could offer a man who was willing to listen to it. Some of the shelves show the marks of his tools, shallow gouge lines in the sandstone that curve with the motion of his arms, as distinctive as handwriting, as permanent as the stone they're cut into. Modern food scientists have a term for what Theron built. They call it a passive energy food storage system, a structure that uses the thermal mass of the Earth, natural convection, and geological humidity to preserve food without any external energy input. Universities study these systems now. Sustainable agriculture advocates promote them. Engineers design sophisticated versions with digital sensors and automated climate controls that adjust dampers by fractions of a degree. But the principle remains what it was on that October day in 1856, when a young man with a canvas sack and a book about chemistry pushed through a curtain of rhododendron, felt warmth against his face, and understood, not with his mind alone, but with the whole of his exhausted, rejected, persistent self, that the earth was offering him something. The earth holds its heat steady. You just have to give it rooms. Theron Ashlock gave it rooms. And the mountain, in return, gave him everything his family had refused: shelter, purpose, abundance, and a legacy that outlasted every acre his brothers fought over, mortgaged, and lost. Surviving, he had learned, was not about enduring. Endurance alone was just slow defeat. Surviving was about building, placing one stone on another, one observation beside the next, one season's knowledge beneath the next season's work, until the structure of a life stood on its own. And building was not about conquering the land. The mountains could not be conquered. Building was about listening, hearing what the stone had to say, feeling the direction of the air, measuring the temperature of the earth, and understanding, with patience and humility, and the kind of stubborn, quiet curiosity that looks like madness from the outside and like purpose from within, that the world will provide for those who pay attention to it. Theron Ashlock paid attention, and the world provided. The cave breathed still,